Something that has always interested me is what happened to people that ran for president but never won the presidency. There have been many losers throughout history that just don't become president. The first one was Charles Coatsworth Pinckney. He was a Federalist from South Carolina, and he was a member of the slave-owning aristocratic elite. He lost the 1804 and 1808 election against Jefferson and Madison. Before running for president, he served as a lieutenant during the Revolution. He was captured by the British in 1780. His dad decided, under threat of seizure of land, to side with the Brits and declared loyalty to the crown. Pinckney was a POW for a year and then released during a prison exchange. After the war, he represented South Carolina, served in the 5th Continental Congress, then stayed involved in South Carolina politics. He had 4 non-consecutive terms as governor of South Carolina, beating his brother for the race one of the times. He also served as senator, campaigned for Democratic Republicans like Jefferson in 1800. He then served as minister to Spain during the first term of Jefferson. He tried but failed to convince Spain to give Florida to the U.S. He supported the War of 1812, universal white male suffrage. Despite being one of the few Federalists to run for president, he became a Democratic Republican. He even publicly supported Monroe's run for president in 1816. He was so much of a Democratic Republican that he decided to run for Congress, mainly because he feared a Federalist gaining a seat. He opposed the Missouri Compromise in 1820. He did this because he supported slavery and saw this as a way for the eastern states to interfere with slavery, meaning it was too far. He retired in 1821, just writing and traveling. Then he died in 1824. The next loser is the election of 1812 loser, DeWitt Clinton. DeWitt Clinton ran as both a Federalist and an anti-war Democratic Republican. He was from New York. He wrote against the ratification of the Constitution. He was another Nepo baby. His uncle was George Clinton, the first governor of New York, and Thomas Jefferson and Madison's vice president. DeWitt Clinton followed his family into New York politics, served in the local New York Assembly and State Senate. Then he became a senator in 1802, supported the 12th Amendment, and he became mayor of New York City from 1803 to 1815. Then New York governor 1817, 1823, and again 1825 to 28, dying in his second term. As governor is where he did what he's most famous for, construction of the Erie Canal. 1816 loser Rufus King was the last Federalist to run for the presidency. Originally, he practiced law in Massachusetts until he joined the militia during the Revolution. He went on to become a member of Congress of the Confederation and was involved in the Constitutional Convention, calling for a strong federal government. At the urging of Alexander Hamilton, he moved to New York City, where he got involved in New York politics, becoming a New York senator, where he stopped the expansion of slavery into the Northwest Territory, and where he defended the Jay Treaty. Then he was a minister to the UK, 1796 to 1803, then ran for Senate in 1804 and lost, was the vice presidential candidate for Pinckney in both the 1804 and 1808 elections, and then he failed to nominate a Federalist candidate for 1812. Then elected to the Senate as representing the state of New York in 1813 to 1825, he would speak out against making Missouri a slave state, calling slavery a nefarious institution. He was then reappointed as a minister to the UK in 1825 to 1826. He retired and died a year later. William H. Crawford came third in the 1824 election. He was part of the old Virginia dynasty that was able to control the presidency for most of the early United States. He would leave Virginia in 1779 to South Carolina, then by 1783 to Georgia. And Georgia is where he got involved in law and politics. He was involved with duels in 1802 and 1806 when he was in the Georgia House, killing his political rivals. And then he became a senator in 1807 to 1813. He declined to be Secretary of War in 1811. He voted in support of the War of 1812. He was a minister to the late era Napoleonic France, 1813 to 15. Then U.S. Secretary of War, 1815 to 1816. Secretary of Treasury, 1816 to 1825. He ran in that four-way race of 1824. Then he just went back to Georgia as a state superior judge, became a Democrat in 1828. He continued to contemplate running for president, but kept deciding not to. He died in Georgia in 1834. One of the most known losers of presidential elections is Henry Clay, the three-time loser from the 1824, 1832, and 1844 elections. He was probably one of the most influential losers, who deserves their own video probably. But Henry Clay entered Kentucky politics in 1803 after years of practicing law, became a member of the House of Representatives in 1810, quickly became Speaker of the House in 1811. He helped negotiate the end of the War of 1812, played a part in the Treaty of Ghent 1815. He supported the idea of a strong federal government focused on infrastructure and high protective tariffs. He was a slave owner that tried to maintain the status quo by compromise, by authoring bills like the Missouri Compromise of 1820, making Missouri a slave state and Maine a free state, and making it illegal for territories north of the Missouri line to be slave states. After coming fourth in the 1824 election, no one got enough electoral votes, leading it to be decided in the House. Between the top three candidates, Clay, as Master of the House, picked Adams to be president. After John Quincy Adams became president, he appointed Clay to the Secretary of State. Jackson saw this as a corrupt bargain. This led to the split of the Democratic-Republican Party, leading to the creation of the Democratic Party, all because Andrew Jackson did not like Henry Clay and his decision in 1825. As Secretary of State, Clay supported the creation of national railroads, negotiating treaties with Latin American countries. When Andrew Jackson became president, Clay was his main rival, opposing the 1830 Indian Removal Act. He returned to the Senate in 1831, ran again for president in 1832, losing to Andrew Jackson and remaining a senator. During the nullification crisis, Clay compromised with South Carolina leaders to create the Tariff of 1833 to end the crisis. He then founded the Whig Party that same year. The Whigs saw what Jackson was doing to the banking system as illegal by undermining the national bank and propping up state banks. Clay didn't run for president in 1836, but decided not to endorse Daniel Webster, leading to their rivalry in the party. In 1839, he lost the nomination to the Whig Party nomination to William Henry Harrison, who actually won that election. Staying in the Senate, Clay successfully got the nomination in 1844, but he lost the presidency to James K. Polk. His slavery positions were hated by abolitionists in the North and by Southern slavery supporters in the South. He saw the Mexican-American War as an illegal and immoral war. His son died in the war in 1848. He lost the Whig nomination for president again to another famous general, who also then became president, Zachary Taylor. He would become a senator again in 1849. He then worked with Democrat Stephen Douglas to create the Compromise of 1850, maintain unity and slavery. He died in 1852. The Whig Party shortly thereafter were unable to live without Clay, splitting over the issue of slavery, the anti-slavery and abolitionists of the party forming the Republican Party. John Floyd came third in the 1832 election, only gaining one state, the state of South Carolina, as a nullifier. Early on, he became involved with medicine after his dad died in 1801 and was put under the care of founding father Dr. Benjamin Rush. Then became a militia surgeon during the War of 1812 until he was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates. He became a member of the House of Representatives in 1816, which he stayed from 1817 to 1829. He did not recognize Seminole sovereignty, therefore he supported Andrew Jackson's illegal actions during the First Seminole War. He wanted the territory of Oregon and proposed settling it as a way for the U.S. to expand westward and to be able to open trade in Asia, particularly China. He campaigned for Andrew Jackson in 1828. He was governor of Virginia from 1830 to 1834, during which the Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831 occurred. When Jackson picked Van Buren as VP for the election of 1832, Floyd was fearful that Van Buren would inject Northern principles and abolish slavery. Ooh, spooky. So Floyd decided that he would run for president to prevent Van Buren from becoming vice president. He was hoping that it would go to the Senate and he would be able to pick a different vice president. Of course, that didn't end up happening. He then unsuccessfully worked with Calhoun and Clay to form their own political party based on the support of slavery. This fizzled out, and they just never were able to compromise on it. He retired after surviving a stroke on the last year of his term as governor in 1834. He died shortly after in 1837 in modern-day West Virginia. Another loser for the 1832 election was William Wirt. William Wirt ran for the anti-Masonic Party. He was a Virginia lawyer and was the prosecutor for the Aaron Burr treason trial of 1807. He was involved in Virginia politics, became U.S. Attorney for the District of Virginia in 1816, then Attorney General in 1817. He was Attorney General for 11 years, till 1829, having the longest tenure of an Attorney General. In 1830, he was chosen to represent the Cherokee. He went before the Supreme Court in 1831 describing the Cherokee Nation as a foreign sovereign nation. In the Cherokee Nation v. Georgia case, he was in front of the Supreme Court again in 1832 on behalf of the Cherokee. Despite himself being a former Freemason, he was nominated by the anti-Masons anyway in 1832, which he came fourth in the election. He did not actively campaign and practice law until he died in 1834. Interestingly enough, in the 1970s, his skull was stolen. His skull was eventually found, and in 2005 was verified Wirt's skull by the Smithsonian. Hugh L. White was one of the four Whigs that ran against Van Buren back in 1836. White was originally a Democrat, where he was involved in local Tennessee politics and law. After the 1824 election, Andrew Jackson resigned from the Senate and White was placed in his seat, being a senator from 1825 to 1840. He started out as a Jackson loyalist. He even drew up one of Jackson's most controversial policies, the Indian Removal Act of 1830. He supported states' rights to slavery and opposed federal intervention on the issue of slavery. He negotiated during the nullification crisis. He angered Jackson and eventually abandoned Jackson. He was against Andrew Jackson making Van Buren president, treating the presidency as a monarchy position with a selected heir. He decided to run as a Whig in 1836. After losing, Jackson allies, Polk, Grundy, and all those that controlled Tennessee, forced White to resign in 1840. He would come home to Tennessee, get sick, and die. Daniel Webster was another loser from 1836. He was from New Hampshire and got involved in law and politics, becoming a Federalist. He became a U.S. Congressman in the House for New Hampshire 1813 to 17. spoke out against the War of 1812, but also spoke out against New England's secession movement. He supported national infrastructure and tariffs, being like any other type of Federalist at the time. He also remained in his law practice, arguing in front of the Supreme Court. He moved to Massachusetts, going back to Congress, this time representing Massachusetts from 1823 to 1827. He supported both Greek and Creek rights, independence for Creek War of Independence and Creek rights. He then went on to the Senate from 1827 to 1841. He supported tariffs and opposed Indian removal in Jackson's spoil system. He allied with Jackson during the nullification crisis, but this was a short-lived alliance, as he went on against Jackson during the War of the National Bank. After his loss in 1836, he continued his work in the Senate. In 1841-43, he became the 14th Secretary of State. He had a strong working relationship with President Tyler. After Tyler vetoed Whig bill after Whig bill, causing all of Tyler's cabinet to quit except Webster. Webster stayed on, played a part in settling the disputed Maine-Canada border in the Washburn-Ashburn Treaty. As Tyler started to campaign for Democrats, Webster finally had enough of Tyler and quit. Webster spoke out against Tyler annexation of Texas. He returned to the Senate during the Polk years 1845 to 1850. Webster was a Cotton Whig, being against federal involvement on the issue of slavery. He opposed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ended the Mexican-American War. He and Clay both tried to run for president in 1848, but were not nominated. Instead, Zachary Taylor got the nomination for the Whig Party. He then gained the second term as Secretary of State, 1850 to 52. Webster helped enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. He opened trade to Japan and secured the release of Hungarian revolutionaries. In 1851, he decided to announce another run for the presidency. He got a lot of support from nativists and anti-Winfield Scott Whigs, but lost the nomination and died October 1852 before the election. Willie P. Magnum was from North Carolina, and he was the fourth Whig to lose in the 1836 election. He allied himself with nullifiers, helping him win the state of South Carolina. He was in the House of Representatives from 1824 to 1826. He then became a Democratic senator in 1830, being there from 1831 to 36. He abandoned the Democratic Party because of his opposition to Andrew Jackson over tariffs and nullification and the banking system. In 1840 to 1853, he rejoined the Senate as an ally to Henry Clay. He retired in 1853 and then joined the Know Nothing Party, dying in 1861 in the Confederate States of America. Lewis Cass was the 1848 loser, a popular sovereignty Democrat. He established a law practice in Ohio, then became a member of the House of Representatives in Ohio from 1806 to 1807. He fought in the War of 1812 and was rewarded for his military service and appointed the second governor of Michigan Territory from 1813 to 1831. He helped negotiate the Treaty of Fort Meigs, which had Native Americans give land to the United States, which led to the Cass Expedition in 1820. He owned at least one slave at the time of his governorship. Jackson appointed him to Secretary of War from 1831 to 36. He argued that American Indians are inherently inferior to whites and unable to be civilized. He implemented Jackson's Indian removal policy, appointed U.S. Ambassador to France from 1836 to 1842. He lost the 1844 Democratic nomination to James K. Polk. Then he went back to the Senate, 1845 to 1848. He then ran for president and lost, going back to the Senate, 1849 to 1847. Then Buchanan appointed Cass as Secretary of State. He attempted to buy Mexican land, and he resigned in 1860 because of Buchanan's failure to take action against secessionists. He retired and returned to Detroit. He supported the Union during the Civil War and died in 1866. Winfield Scott was the last Whig to run for president. He was a loser in 1852. Scott was a military man, joining the Army in 1808. In 1810, he was court-martialed for making disrespectful comments about his superior officer, and because of mismanaging of military accounts. He blamed a friend of the officer for his court-martial, leading to a duel. Neither men were harmed. He then served during the War of 1812 on the Canadian front, rising the rank to Brigadier General in 1814. He was wounded at the Battle of Lundy Lane. After the war, he went to Europe to study warfare, but arrived after Waterloo, unable to study Napoleonic tactics from the master himself, Napoleon. Then he was assigned to the Northwest Territories. He concluded the Black Hawk War in Illinois. After the Indian Removal Act, Scott played his part putting down Indian resistance and led the removal of the Cherokee. During the disputes of the Patriot War and Arstook War, he negotiated treaties between the United Kingdom and America. He attempted to run as a Whig in 1839, but lost the nomination to William Henry Harrison. In 1841, he was made the commanding general of the U.S. Army, the highest office in the Army. Again, he attempted to get the nomination for president for the Whig Party in 1844, but lost to Henry Clay. Polk tried to weaken Scott's power during the Mexican-American War, but he still led campaigns to capture Mexico City and Veracruz, defeating Santa Anna. Again, Scott went for the Whig Party nomination, but lost to another Mexican-American war hero, Zachary Taylor. Meaning, just like Henry Clay, he lost the Whig nomination, the only 2 times the Whig won the presidential elections. In 1850, he supported the Compromise of 1850. Despite this, Northern anti-compromise Whigs backed Scott for the election of 1852. Finally, he was nominated the Whig Party candidate, but he was the last candidate and lost the election badly, only winning 4 states. Still the head of the U.S. Army, he came at odds with Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. As the 1850s America became more divided over the issue of slavery, Scott was out of the picture and he was sent to San Juan Islands off the coast of Washington to resolve the Pig War, preventing a major war with the UK again. Scott convinced Buchanan to reinforce D.C., Fort Sumter, and Fort Pickens as the southern states begin to secede. Scott remained loyal. As he said, "I shall consider myself responsible for Lincoln's safety. If necessary, I shall plant cannons at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, and if the Maryland or Virginia gentlemen who become so threatened and troublesome sow their heads or even venture to raise a finger, I shall blow them to hell." Helping Lincoln arrive to White House safely, he advised the president on the Civil War. He developed the Anaconda Plan to take the Mississippi River, cut the South in 2, and remain a blockade of the southern coastline to stop the international trade of cotton to completely wreck the Confederate economy. Scott was an old, fat man from the Napoleonic era, unable to go to a battlefield and deal with more modern conflict of the Civil War. He would retire and be replaced by George B. McClellan. In retirement, Scott still was useful. He aided in diffusing the Trent Affair, keeping the British out of the Civil War. Lincoln still visited the old man for advice. Some advice he gave was replacing McClellan with Halleck. When he finished his memoirs, he gave it to Grant in 1864. Grant was able to modernize Scott's Anaconda Plan to defeat the Confederacy. Scott lived to see the end of the war. He got to join many veteran organizations. He died at the age of 79 in 1866. John C. Fremont, 1856 loser and first Republican to run for president. He was born in Georgia and raised by his mother in a household enslaved woman named Black Hannah. He was a believer in Western expansion and he wanted to live a life of adventure. He started out teaching mathematics on the USS Natchez, sailing the South American seas. After that, he went to work for the railroad. He went to assist scientists to explore the land between the Mississippi and Missouri River. This exploration brought him to the attention of Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri, a devoted believer in manifest destiny. The senator also had a 16-year-old daughter, who Fremont, at the age of 28, married in 1841. This senator, and now father-in-law of Fremont, used his influence to make Fremont a leader of expeditions out west. The exploration made the West more accessible to Americans, encouraging Americans to brave the frontier and go west. His maps helped depict the now famous Oregon Trail. On his second expedition, he reached the Sacramento Valley in 1844. He explored the Rockies, California, and Nevada. Before the Mexican-American War, Fremont was told to survey more of the West in modern-day Utah, Nevada, and California. He met with President Polk and exclaimed his desire for conquest of California. Fremont in 1846 made it out to California, and his military force faced off against Mexican troops. He raised the U.S. flag on Mexican soil. Fremont and his men were forced north to Oregon. In Oregon, he led a genocidal massacre. That was the Sacramento River Massacre in 1846, and Fremont ordered his men to kill Native women and children in point-blank range, with pistols or slashing them with knives. None of his men were killed, and he ordered any Indian should be killed on sight. Fremont and his men weren't done with their genocide. They also committed the Commonwealth Lake Massacre. After this, his troops were able to re-enter California, where he led another massacre, the Butte Massacre. Then Fremont incited American settlers to revolt against the Mexican officials. They captured the largest settlement in Northern California. These rebels created their own flag, forming the Bear Flag Republic, which is the famous flag you see on California today. Fremont became a major in California's battalion. His men went south to take San Diego. The hostiles between California and Mexico would rage on until the 1847 Treaty of Calhoun, in which Fremont was one of the signatories. After this, Fremont would become the month-long military governor of California. For disobeying orders and giving orders of the California battalions to refuse to become part of the U.S. Army, he was arrested in 1847. He was found guilty in 1848 for disobedience of military orders. President Polk quickly commuted Fremont's sentence to placate Fremont's father-in-law. Fremont wanted to restore his honor and reputation, and he went on 4 expeditions. He went out to Missouri, Kansas areas and rivers west to Colorado, exploring the mountains in the bitter snowy winters, to New Mexico and then Arizona territory. He then went back to California. He ran for the Senate as a Free Soil Democrat in 1849. He passed laws to prevent foreigners from owning gold claims so he could protect his interests in California. He was in favor of abolishing slavery in D.C. His anti-slavery positions made him unpopular with the Democrats, which pushed him out of power. After this, he decided to go on another expedition to map out land for the Transcontinental Railroad. The Republican Party was just founded, and the 43-year-old Fremont became the first ever candidate for the 1856 presidential election. Democrats attacked Fremont's illegitimate birth and alleged Fremont was a Catholic. He lost the election, but the Supreme Court confirmed that the land deed of the Mariposa Gold Estate belonged to Fremont. In the outbreak of the Civil War, Fremont was in Europe. Lincoln wanted Fremont to become minister to France because of his French ancestry and his staunch anti-slavery beliefs, keeping the French out of the Civil War. However, he was seen as too radical for Secretary of State Seward, so instead Fremont became a major general in the Union Army. He was stationed in Cairo, Illinois, protected the Union advance down to the Mississippi River. One of his subordinates was none other than Ulysses Grant. Fremont's main focus was the state of Missouri, and getting the Confederates out. In St. Louis, was seen as a French-style aristocrat. He rented a mansion guarded by guards in fancy European outfits. And all this on the taxpayers' dime. He gave out contracts to his friends, helping them profit from the war. His corruption was talked about, but he was able to keep his position. He fought in many battles, like the Battle of Springfield, which led to the capture of Springfield, Missouri. After being driven out of Missouri, he wanted to reorganize his forces. He chose Grant to lead Union forces in the Western Theater, making Grant a national known name, and eventually getting the attention of Lincoln. Fremont put Missouri under martial law without Lincoln's approval in 1861. This made citizens take up arms against the Union, and he treated them as court-martialed soldiers, and their property would be seized, and all enslaved people owned by rebels would be emancipated. Lincoln thought this emancipation order would flip the border state of Missouri to a Confederate state. Fremont still refused to reverse the order. Lincoln fired Fremont, causing uproar among radical Republicans. and then Lincoln put Fremont back in command, this time in Virginia and Tennessee. He would have limited rule in the rest of the war. He attempted to run against Lincoln in 1864 as a radical Democrat, but dropped out once Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation and fired more conservative cabinet members. He invested in the railroad and lost his wealth in the Panic of 1873. Hayes made him Arizona Territory Governor from 1878 to 1881, then he retired to Staten Island and died in 1890. 1860 was a four-way race that first split the Democrats into two, North and South. The Southern Democrats were led by John C. Breckinridge. Breckinridge was from a political dynasty. His grandfather was Thomas Jefferson's Attorney General. His family was involved in Kentucky politics. The difference was that unlike his family, who were all Whigs, he was a Democrat. He campaigned for James K. Polk in the Mexican-American War. He joined the war effort, becoming a third major in the 3rd Kentucky Infantry after the fighting stopped, so he didn't do much. He supported the court-martial of Winfield Scott, trying to strip his power, prevent Scott's political rise. After the war, he was a slave owner. He supported the colonization of Liberia to send free black people. He was elected to the Kentucky House of Representatives from 1849 to 1850, then the U.S. House from 1851 to 55. In the House, he defended the Fugitive Slave Act, and when Clay died, which gave his eulogy, he was an ally to Stephen Douglas, supporting popular sovereignty. After his term, John C. Breckinridge supported Douglas run for president in 1856. He lost the Democratic nomination to James Buchanan, and Breckinridge became his VP. As vice president, he supported admitting Kansas as a slave state, alienating Northern Democrats like his old ally, Douglas. The relationship between Douglas and Breckinridge worsened as the nation became more divided. They became opponents in 1859 for the 1860 Democratic nomination. Breckinridge, who supported a federal slave code, went against Democrats' position and Douglas's position on popular sovereignty. The Democrats divided over the issue of slavery. Pro-slavery Democrats walked out of the convention and nominated John C. Breckinridge as their candidate. After the election, he met with the winner, Abe Lincoln, and his cousin, Mary Todd Lincoln. He supported the Crittenden Compromise. After the fire in Fort Sumter, he supported Kentucky's secession. Kentucky became a neutral border state. For his support for the Confederacy, he was seen as a traitor and expelled from the Senate. After being expelled, he became a Confederate brigadier general. He fought in many battles, including Shiloh, Baton Rouge, Chickamauga, and Chattanooga. For the last few months of the Confederacy, he was promoted to the Secretary of War of the Confederate States. After the war, the Confederate government was dissolved. Breckinridge was a Confederate on the run. On the run, he joined with some ex-Confederates and hijacked the boat to escape the country. They made it to Cuba, escaping 2 storms and pirates. John C. Breckinridge in Cuba met with a Confederate agent who had ties in Britain, which helped him escape to Canada, where he met up with his wife. He eventually moved to France and went on a worldwide tour through Germany, Syria, Egypt. After his tour, he went back to Niagara, Canada. He stayed in Canada until he was pardoned by Andrew Johnson, returning to Kentucky in 1869. All his post-war business ventures failed, and he died in 1875. The Northern Democrat for 1860 was Stephen Douglas. He moved to Illinois in 1833, where he got involved in law and politics. He supported Andrew Jackson and the Democratic Party. Douglas helped organize the first state Democratic convention, supported Martin Van Buren. Douglas was elected to the House of Representatives in 1836. He entered the House the same time that Whig Abraham Lincoln did. Douglas lost re-election in 1838. He became the Illinois Secretary of State. He helped to arrange the state charter for the Mormon settlement of Nauvoo, Illinois. In 1841, Douglas expanded the Illinois Supreme Court from 4 to 9 justices, making the Whig-dominated court a Democrat one. In 1842, he was elected to the House of Representatives again, and he supported annexation of Texas and the war against Mexico. During the war, he became a senator, and he was one of the 4 Democrats to vote against the Wilmot Proviso, which would have banned slavery in land gained from the Mexican-American War. Instead, Douglas wanted to extend the Missouri Compromise line. Douglas supported Clay's Compromise of 1850, His support of the Compromise of 1850 made him a national figure. Douglas was a big proponent of popular sovereignty, the idea that every state should have the choice if they want to be a slave state or a free state. He was a proponent of the Transcontinental Railroad, and he proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which extended the slavery issue out west, giving both territories the right to decide they want to be a slave state, despite being above the Missouri Compromise line. This leads to Bleeding Kansas and eventually the whole sectional crisis of anti- and pro-slavery advocates combating each other. Douglas became unpopular in the North. He would famously debate Abe Lincoln up and down the state of Illinois while both were running for the Senate. Douglas would win. It wouldn't be long until they faced a rematch, this time running for the presidency in 1860. He won the nomination for the Northern Democratic Party as the party divided North and South. After losing the election, he tried to prevent the Civil War by supporting the Crittenden Compromise. And after the siege of Fort Sumter, Douglas met with Lincoln, advising him to call for 200,000 troops. Lincoln only called for 75,000. He supported the Union and died June 3rd, the same day as the Battle of Philippi, the first skirmish during the Civil War. John Bell was the constitutional Union candidate in 1860. He was from the old slave-owning planter class from Tennessee. He got involved in law and politics in Tennessee. He became a member of the House of Reps in 1826, running against Felix Grundy. In the House, he opposed the Tariff of 1828. He was the chairman of the House Committee of Indian Affairs, in which he supported the 1830 Indian Removal Act. In 1834, the House race for Speaker, pro-Andrew Jackson members supported Polk for Speaker, while anti-Jackson members supported Bell for Speaker. Bell became Speaker of the House from 1834 to 35. Bell supported Hugh L. White race for the presidency. After these two acts, Jackson denounced Bell. Bell continued to lose speakership votes to Polk. He failed to pass legislation against the spoils system. In 1841, Bell became Secretary of War. Like the rest of Tyler's cabinet, he quit after Tyler abandoned Whig policies. He went back to local Tennessee politics and supported campaigning against his rival, James K. Polk. When Polk became president, Bell re-entered national politics and became a senator in 1847-59. In the Senate, he opposed the Mexican-American War and voted for the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Bell opposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act because it went against the Missouri Compromise status quo, being one of two senators to vote against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. After the death of the Whig Party, Bell campaigned for know-nothing candidates. He voted against Kansas being a slave state in 1858. In 1860, he ran for president. He wanted to maintain the status quo, slavery in the South, no slavery in the North and Missouri line. But he was too little too late. He supported the Confederacy after the Union Army occupied Tennessee, and Bell fled to Alabama and Georgia. After the war, he came back to Tennessee, managed ironworks, and he died in 1869. 1864 loser, George B. McClellan, graduated from West Point and went into military service during the Mexican-American War. He served in the Battle of Contreras, Churubusco, and Coatepec in Mexico. He contracted dysentery and malaria. His father was friends with Winfield Scott, which helped him rise the ranks in the military. He was involved in the Red River expedition, which was ambushed by the Comanche. In 1854, Secretary of War Jefferson Davis sent McClellan on a secret mission to St. Domingo. He learned the defensive capabilities, which was later used by President Grant in 1870 when he attempted to annex the Dominican Republic. McClellan was an observer of the Crimean War, and he observed the siege of Sevastopol in 1855. In 1857, McClellan became chief engineer of the Illinois Central Railroad, and then president of Ohio and Mississippi Railroad in 1860. He was vocal in politics and supported Democrats, especially Stephen Douglas. During the Civil War, he became commander of the Pennsylvania Militia. Then he became commander of the Military District, Department of Ohio. He was sent to occupy what is modern-day West Virginia. During the war, he was overly cautious and also overly cocky. He took sole credit of the success of the Battle of Rich Mountain. He claimed that he crushed all Confederates in West Virginia and that he liberated West Virginia from the Confederacy all by himself. He was seen as the only man early in 1861 that gave the North a victory, leading to his attention from Abraham Lincoln. McClellan was seen as a hero. He was against Scott's Anaconda Plan. Instead, he supported one grand battle, one campaign to crush Confederates. After Winfield Scott retired in November 1861, McClellan became head of all Union armies. Lincoln and McClellan did not have a good working relationship. McClellan often ignored Lincoln and refused to attend meetings with him. McClellan looked down on Lincoln and saw him as an imbecile. McClellan, one time, kept Lincoln waiting. While McClellan stayed in bed, Lincoln was down waiting for him. This disobedience was accepted at first because Lincoln was hoping for a quick, crushing defeat of the Confederacy. Unfortunately, the war dragged on. Lincoln tried to replace McClellan as the war was raging on with John Pope, who failed at the Battle of Second Bull Run, making Lincoln stuck with McClellan. McClellan's downfall was caused by two battles, Antietam and the 7 Days Battle. Antietam was the bloodiest battle in American history. The Union had outnumbered the Confederate forces, but McClellan was tricked to believe he was outnumbered. McClellan was now seen as cautious and inept and failed to aggressively pursue Lee. After McClellan was fired, he campaigned against Lincoln in 1864. He lost the election, and after the war, McClellan went on a 2-year tour of Europe. Came back, became involved in the railroad, became chief engineer of New York City. He spent another 3 years in Europe. Came back, campaigned 1877 for the governor of New Jersey. He was governor of New Jersey from 1878 to 1881. He cut taxes. He used his military experience to save New Jersey National Guard. In fact, he equipped the New Jersey National Guard with Gatling guns. And after his term, he supported Grover Cleveland's run for president in 1884. McClellan just wrote his memoirs and traveled, and died in 1885. Horatio Seymour, 1868 loser. He was a New York Democrat, became mayor of Utica from 1842 to 43, and in 1845 he was Speaker of the New York State Assembly. Seymour was the New York governor from 1853 to 54, but his support of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and anti-Democrat surge led to his defeat. Seymour supported Stephen Douglas for the 1860 election. During the Civil War, Seymour would support the war effort, but remained critical of Lincoln's handling of the war, returning as governor of New York in the election of 1862, being governor again from 1863 to 64. Seymour was the most prominent politician to oppose Lincoln. During his tenure, the New York draft riots occurred. He tried to concede to the rioters. Because of his sympathy with the rioters, he was accused of treason and siding with the Confederacy. Lost the race for governor in 1864. He became a prominent Democrat as chairman of the DNC. After the war, he supported Andrew Johnson, Reconstruction policies, and opposed racial Reconstruction. Seymour was mainly opposed to civil rights and political rights for freedmen, and ran in 1868 against Republicans as the party of the black man and the Democrat Party of the white man. He lost against Grant in that race. After that election, he remained in New York as an elder statesman. Became a chancellor of Union College in 1873. Made his last political efforts campaigning for Grover Cleveland in 1884. Seymour died in 1886. Horace Greeley was the 1872 loser. In 1831, Greeley, seeking profit, moved to New York City. In New York City, he became a newspaper publisher, and he took the view that poor people should go west to seek a better life, to tell young men to go west. Greeley became a vital propagandist for the Whig Party. Greeley helped campaign for Whig William Seward for governor of New York in 1838. In 1840, he played a vital role in the campaign for William Henry Harrison. Greeley established the New York Tribune. The Tribune was a Whig rag that supported Whig policies and Henry Clay. Greeley became a vocal opponent to the institution of slavery and annexation of Texas. Greeley hired Margaret Fuller, a feminist. She wrote 200 articles for the Tribune and even lived with the Greeley family. Greeley became a congressman from 1848 to 49. As congressman, he supported Irish independence and introduced the Homestead Act. After serving in the House, the Tribune became more popular and less of a Whig rag. Greeley supported the Compromise of 1850 at first, then he opposed it. At this time, the Tribune hired Karl Marx as a foreign correspondent. Greeley attended the first New York Republican Convention in 1854. Greeley published the biography of 1856 candidate John C. Fremont. During the war, he at first supported the peaceful separation from the South, but later became a staunch Unionist, supporting the war effort in the Emancipation Proclamation. He supported the draft, which made him a target from the anti-draft rioters. 150 soldiers were needed to protect Greeley and the Tribune. Greeley was hoping to replace Lincoln in 1864, but just like everything else, he changed his mind and became a staunch Lincoln supporter. After the capture of Atlanta, Greeley wanted a moderate Reconstruction until Lincoln was assassinated, and again changing his mind for a radical Reconstruction. He supported the impeachment of Andrew Johnson and the radical Republicans. Greeley tried to find Union colony in 1869, a utopian kind of like commune. Democrats were unable to get their own candidate for president, but were able to ally themselves with the anti-corruption, anti-grant wing of the Republican Party, the Liberal Republican. Nominated Greeley. He lost but died less than a month after the election, before the Electoral College could meet, leading to a mess of a map. Samuel J. Tilden was the 1876 loser. A Democrat from New York, he got involved in New York City politics. In 1844, he was a delegate for the Democratic Party, supporting James K. Polk for president. Then he went back to New York politics as a member of the New York Assembly. From 1846 to 47, Tilden was a barn-burner Democrat, the anti-slavery wing of the Democratic Party. Tilden opposed Lincoln in the initial use of force, but supported the Union as the war raged on. Tilden managed Horatio Seymour's 1862 New York governor campaign. Tilden also played a role in the nomination of George B. McClellan in 1864. After the war, Tilden became the chair of the New York Democratic Party from 1866 to 74. During this time, Tilden managed Seymour's 1868 run for president. Tilden had a falling out with the corrupt Tammany Hall political machine in 1871, but Tilden became governor of New York in the 1874 election, being governor from 1875 to 76. He ran an anti-corruption campaign, and in the election of 1876, ran against Reconstruction. Tilden won the popular vote, but the Electoral College vote was disputed. In the Compromise of 1877, Tilden and the Democrats were willing to accept defeat as long as Hayes ended Reconstruction and brought the troops home, making him lose by one electoral vote. Hayes became president, but at a terrible cost, the end of Reconstruction. After the election, Tilden was hoping to be nominated in 1880, but lost the Democratic nomination. In 1884, Tilden supported Grover Cleveland's run for president, and spent the rest of his life as a bachelor, living alone in Yonkers, New York, dying in 1886. Winfield Scott Hancock was a 1880 loser, named after another presidential loser. In fact, he got to meet his namesake during the Mexican War, serving under Scott. Hancock engaged in the battles of Contreras and Churubusco. After the Mexican-American War, he remained in the military service out west. He was involved in Bleeding, Kansas, and he was serving in Utah after the Utah War. He stayed in Southern California until the outbreak of the Civil War. Hancock served during the Civil War. He led a crucial counterattack at the Battle of Williamsburg. Hancock was wounded at the battles of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Hancock's most famous service was that of Corps Commander during the Battle of Gettysburg, gaining national fame from the battle of his only major defeat, happening during the siege of Petersburg. After the war, Hancock supervised the execution of the conspirators behind the Lincoln assassination. Andrew Johnson believed Hancock would better enforce Johnson's Reconstruction policies than the Republican generals, because Hancock was a Democrat and had the similar beliefs as Andrew Johnson. Hancock was in control of the 5th Military District. This district would include Texas and Louisiana. Hancock wanted a quick restoration and supported white Southern Dems gaining power again. Hancock supported Johnson's policies of order against black civil rights. After Grant won, he wanted to keep Hancock away from the South, sending him out west. Out west, he was fighting in the Indian Wars, hoping to conquer Indian land for white ownership. Out west, he contributed in the creation of Yellowstone National Park. After that, he was sent out east to have time to gain power politically. He tried to get the Democratic nomination for president in 1876, but failed. He got the nomination in 1880. The main campaign differences Democrats and Republicans were arguing about were tariffs. After his defeat, Hancock attended Garfield's inauguration. He may not have become president of the nation, but he became president of the National Rifle Association in 1881. He remained active in veterans organizations, made his last appearance at Grant's funeral in 1885. Hancock died in 1886. James Blaine was the 1884 loser and the first Republican loser since the Civil War. Blaine started out as a professor of mathematics and ancient languages at the Western Military Institute. The school is in Kentucky, the state of Henry Clay. Blaine became an admirer of Clay, and in the 1850s, Blaine moved to Maine, became a newspaperman. Blaine became vocal in Maine politics, supporting the newly formed Republican Party. He was a delegate in the first Republican National Convention in 1856. Blaine was already a part of the conservative wing of the Republican Party. Blaine served in local Maine politics and supported Lincoln in 1860. In 1862, Blaine went national by being elected to the House of Representatives. Blaine clashed with radicals like Thaddeus Stevens in the House. Blaine voted to impeach Andrew Johnson. Blaine believed in strong money and fiscal conservatism. He supported the gold standard. In 1869, Blaine became the Speaker of the House, leading the House during the Grant administration. He worked with Grant to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Blaine was loyal to Grant and stayed loyal despite Grant's corruption. Blaine supported free public education and separation of church and state. Blaine tried to pass a constitutional amendment to prevent state funding going to religious schools. This amendment failed. Blaine was a potential candidate for 1876, but wasn't nominated because of revelations of Blaine taking bribes from the Union Pacific. Blaine, unable to be the Republican nominee for president, instead became a senator from 1876 to 81. He opposed the removal of troops from the South and the end of Reconstruction. With the Battle of Reconstruction lost, the main issue for the senator from Maine was hard money. He also gained foreign policy experience and supported the expansion of the Navy. He competed for the Republican nomination in 1880, losing the nomination to Garfield. Garfield appointed Blaine as Secretary of State in 1881. As Secretary of State, he promoted free trade and helped negotiate a peace for the war in the Pacific. In 1884, Blaine again contended for the Republican nomination, this time winning the nomination, but losing the election to Grover Cleveland. Blaine remained an important leader of the party, supporting the party and backing Republican candidates. He sailed to Europe, visiting many countries including Ireland, Germany, France, and Austria-Hungary. He supported Benjamin Harrison's run for the Republican nomination in 1888. After Harrison became president, he appointed Blaine as Secretary of State for his second time in office. Blaine shaped Harrison's foreign policy. Blaine supported America becoming an imperial power. Blaine hoped to conquer Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. Blaine got sick and resigned in the summer of 1892. Many thought he was attempting to run in 1892, but he decided not to because of his poor health and died January 1893. James B. Weaver was an 1892 populist loser. Weaver started out as a mailman until he quit to get involved with law. At law school, he became an opponent to the institution of slavery, gave speeches in support of Republicans in Iowa. Weaver traveled with the Iowa delegation for the 1860 Republican Convention. Weaver enlisted in the 2nd Iowa Infantry during the Civil War, fought at battles of Fort Donelson and the Battle of Shiloh. And then after the war, Weaver became an editor for a Republican rag called Weekly Union Guard. He came second in the Republican nomination for Iowa Lieutenant Governor in 1865. A year later, Weaver was elected as district attorney. Weaver associated himself with the Prohibition movement and had no stated opinion on the issue. As the conservative wing of the Republican Party was taking power, Weaver felt apart from the Republican Party, switching to the Greenback Party in 1876. As a Greenback member, he was against the gold standard and supported an 8-hour workday, end of child labor, and the end of wage slavery. In 1878, he became a Greenback candidate for the House. Weaver was elected to the Representatives in 1879-81. In Congress, he became an advocate for free silver and for the government to print money, and he promoted an amendment for a direct election of senators. In 1880, Weaver became the Greenback nominee for president, getting around 3% of the vote, no electoral votes. In 1883, he was a candidate for Iowa governor. In 1884, Weaver was a delegate for the Greenback Party, supporting Benjamin Butler for president. Weaver was elected back to Congress, but this time with support from Democrats. In the House, he proposed the creation of the Department of Labor. Weaver wanted to open the West for white settlement, supporting the Dawes Act. The Greenback Party died down, but there was still support for progressive policies out west. Farmers out west supported soft money, joining the Farmer Alliance. Weaver formed a new party with the support of the Farmer Alliance. This party was the People's Party / the Populist Party. The Populist Party supported nationalizing the railroads, telegraph and telephone systems, soft money politics, and graduated income tax. He lost the election of 1892. After that, Weaver became allies with William Jennings Bryan, supporting Bryan's run for the presidency. Weaver became a Democrat, campaigning for Democrats, even ones he didn't like Alton B. Parker. Weaver died in 1912. William Jennings Bryan was a 3-time loser in 1896, 1900, and 1908. Bryan grew up in Salem, Illinois, and studied law in Chicago, afterwards moving to Lincoln, Nebraska. In Nebraska, he became politically involved, supporting the Democrats. In 1890, he ran for Congress as a progressive free silver Democrat. His support for free silver and progressive policies like a graduating income tax gained him support from the Populist Party. Bryan ran and lost the Senate. In 1894, he became a speaker, going across the country to push the Democrats away from Grover Cleveland's urban conservative economic policies. In 1896, with the support of free silver wing of the Democrats and the alliance with the Populist Party, William Jennings Bryan became the nominee for president. He spoke against the gold standard in his famous Cross of Gold speech.
If they dare to come out in the open field and defend the gold standard as a good thing, we will fight them to the uttermost. Having behind us the producing masses of this nation and the world, supported by the commercial interests, the laboring interests, and the toilers everywhere, we will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold.
Bryan supported the Spanish-American War because he believed in Cuban independence, but he was upset with the aftermath and against the Philippine-American War. Bryan was against American imperialism. Anti-imperialism was his main campaign policy in his run in 1900. After the election, Bryan went back to journalism and the speech circuit. Bryan supported Theodore Roosevelt's progressive policies, but believed that they didn't go far enough. Bryan traveled to Europe, where he met with Leo Tolstoy. In 1908, he went back to America for his run for the presidency. He ran a progressive campaign and lost to William Howard Taft. After the election, Bryan came out in favor of women's suffrage and prohibition. In 1912, Bryan backed Wilson. Bryan was rewarded for his support and made Secretary of State. Bryan helped Wilson pass antitrust measures, reducing tariffs and a progressive income tax. Despite being against American imperialism, he oversaw Wilson's invasion of Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Mexico. Bryan resigned from Secretary of State in 1915. Bryan wanted to stay out of World War I and remain neutral, but Wilson was becoming closely aligned with the Allies. When the U.S. entered World War I, Bryan supported the war, became less involved with politics, becoming a religious figure representing the interests of preventing public schools from teaching evolution in the Scopes monkey trial. He was no longer the young progressive he was, now an old man scared of the new world, dying in 1925. Alton B. Parker was the 1904 loser. He got involved in New York politics and law, becoming Chief Justice of the New York Court of Appeals from 1898 to 1904. As Justice, he supported privacy rights and the death penalty. In 1904, he ran as a conservative Democrat against the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party, facing William Randolph Hearst. After gaining the nomination, he lost to Theodore Roosevelt. After being defeated by Roosevelt, Parker went back to New York and became the president of the American Bar Association from 1906 to 1907. He had a successful career representing labor unions, representing Samuel Gompers in the Supreme Court case, Gomper v. United States. Parker gave the keynote speech for the 1912 Democratic National Convention in support of Woodrow Wilson. In 1913, he led the impeachment of New York Governor William Schuster, and Parker died in New York in 1926. Eugene Debs was the socialist candidate who got 6% of the vote in 1912, making him a notable candidate. Debs was from Terre Haute, Indiana. His house is on the modern campus grounds of Indiana State University. He originally felt that socialism wasn't needed in America because America had already had its revolution and wasn't a monarchy. As a Democrat, he was city clerk of Terre Haute from 79 to 83 and House of Representatives from 1885 to 87. After serving as a Democrat, he got involved with railroad labor organizations, getting involved with the Burlington strike of 1888. He saw the need for reorganizing after the strike, leading to the Pullman strike. He led the Pullman strike. As a Democrat, Debs believed Grover Cleveland would support him, but that ended up not happening. Instead, Cleveland sent the army to Union Bus and stopped the strike. Debs was arrested and disillusioned. At the McHenry County Jail in Woodstock, he was radicalized by talking to prisoners and reading Marx. He supported William Jennings Bryan for the 1896, but after Bryan's defeat, Debs founded his own party, the Social Democratic Party. As a socialist, he ran for president in 1900. After 1900, he formed another party, the Socialist Party of America. Debs ran in 1904, 1908, 1912, and 1920 presidential elections. In Chicago, he was one of the founders of the Industrial Workers of the World in 1905, the One Big Union, with the hope to organize all workers of the world in one union. During World War I, he was a staunch anti-imperialist and talked against the war. During his famous Canton speech against the war, and talked about resisting the draft, that he wouldn't fight a capitalist war, that class war is the only war he would fight. He was arrested, and his conviction was upheld by the Supreme Court. His last time running for president was in 1920, which he famously ran for president as a prisoner. President Harding commuted Debs' sentence, getting released from prison in December 21. He spent the rest of his life in poor health, dying in 1926. Charles Evan Hughes was the 1916 loser. He was from New York and got involved in law, then became a law professor at Cornell Law School. He later went on to expose corruption in utilities and insurance companies. Theodore Roosevelt suggested Hughes can defeat William Randolph Hearst for the race for New York governor, which he did. Hughes became governor 1907 to 1910. As governor, his main focus was fighting corruption and to enact labor reforms. In 1910, President Taft appointed Hughes as Associate Judge to the Supreme Court. He then resigned so he could free up time so he could run for president in 1916, which he failed. He joined the Republicans demanding Wilson to go to war against the Central Powers during World War I. He returned to his law practice. He decided not to run for president in 1920 because of the death of his daughter. Hughes became Secretary of State from 1921 to 25. Hughes advised Harding to sign a U.S.-German peace treaty. Hughes wanted a closer relationship with the UK. Hughes' Washington Naval Treaty prevented a naval arms race between the U.S., UK, and Japan. In 1928, he campaigned for Herbert Hoover. Hughes then became judge for the Permanent Court of International Justice from 1928 to 1930. After the death of Supreme Court Chief Justice William Howard Taft, Hoover appointed Hughes as Chief Justice. He replaced the Chief Justice that originally appointed Hughes as Supreme Court Justice when he was president. Hughes was a thorn in the side of FDR. Hughes judged many New Deal programs as unconstitutional. FDR threatened to pack the courts to protect the New Deal. Charles Edmund Hughes gave in eventually, as the Supreme Court became majority pro-New Deal. By late 1937, the Hughes Court would upheld economic regulations. He retired in 1941 and lived a quiet life, making rare public appearances. He advised the Truman administration, reviewed the UN Charter, and recommended Fred Vinson as Chief Justice in 1946. Hughes died in 1948. James Cox was the 1920 loser. Cox was a newspaper man from Ohio. In 1894, he became an assistant to businessman and Congressman Paul J. Sorg. Sorg helped Cox require Dayton Evening News, which Cox renamed the Dayton Daily News. He crusaded against Dayton's Republican boss, Joseph E. Lowes. James Cox ran for the House of Representatives in 1908. Cox was in the House from 1909 to 1913 until he resigned to be governor of Ohio. Cox was governor, supporting World War I, the League of Nations, Prohibition, and women's suffrage. Cox supported a law to ban the German language during the anti-German paranoia. Cox then was the Democratic nominee for president, with Franklin Roosevelt as his VP candidate. Cox would leave politics after his loss to become a media mogul. He built a large corporate empire called Cox Enterprise. He supported all of FDR's runs for the presidency, and was appointed by FDR as delegate to the London Economic Conference. Cox published his memoirs in 1946, then died in 1957. John W. Davis was the 1924 loser. Davis was a Southern Democrat from West Virginia. He adopted many of his father's conservative beliefs. He opposed women's suffrage, anti-lynching legislation, and child labor laws. He was elected to the West Virginia House of Delegates in 1898. He was a delegate at the 1904 Democratic nomination, supporting Alton Parker. Davis was elected in 1912 to the U.S. House of Representatives. Davis was one of the managers that impeached Judge Robert Archibald. Davis was appointed by Woodrow Wilson as Solicitor General from 1913 to 1918, in which he argued against the Grandfather Clause in Oklahoma Constitution that disenfranchised black voters. Davis was then appointed as U.S. Ambassador to the UK from 1918 to 1921. Davis was a potential candidate in 1920, but wouldn't be a candidate until 1924. The Democrats were divided between Al Smith, a Catholic against Prohibition, versus McAdoo, a Southerner who was pro-Prohibition. As a compromise candidate, John W. Davis was picked as a Southerner who was anti-Prohibition. After the election, he joined Rockefeller and Carnegie foundations. Davis campaigned for FDR in 1932. Davis abandoned FDR as an anti-New Dealer. Smedley Butler even implicated Davis in the business plot to overthrow the Roosevelt administration. He campaigned for Republicans in 1936, 1940, and 1944. Davis supported Alger Hiss and J. Robert Oppenheimer during the era of McCarthyism. Davis went back to law, arguing 140 cases before the Supreme Court. Famously, he defended this separate but equal cause in the Brown v. Board of Education case. Davis died in 1955. Robert Follett, aka Fighting Bob, was the 1924 progressive loser. Follett was involved in Wisconsin law and politics, serving in the U.S. House from 1885 to 1891. His views in the House were typical of Northern Republicans. After an attempted bribery, he had a political epiphany. He would run for governor of Wisconsin unsuccessfully in 1896 and 1898. He fought for reform, believing that a primary system that allows for voters to directly choose the party instead of parties choosing the candidate in smoke-filled rooms. In 1900, he finally won the race for governor, being governor of Wisconsin from 1901 to 1906. His main agenda was reform, implementing primary elections, and creating a progressive income tax. Follett then became a senator from 1906 to 1925. In the Senate, he passed a law in 1907 to prohibit railroad workers from working more than 16 consecutive hours. In 1908, Follett was hoping to be the Republican nominee for president, but didn't get enough support. In the Senate, he led a progressive faction. The faction fought for lower tariffs and proposed the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, allowing the government to create a federal income tax. Follett was hoping to use taxes to redistribute wealth. Follett formed the National Progressive Republican League, focused on passing progressive reforms. Theodore Roosevelt was notably not a member in 1912. He attempted but failed for the Republican nomination. He remained neutral in the 1912 election. Follett passed the Seamen's Act, which allowed sailors to quit and required all passenger ships to require lifeboats. Follett was opposed to intervention in Latin America and also opposed the U.S. entry into World War I. Follett supported the Bolsheviks and opposed Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War. Follett helped to unearth the Teapot Dome scandal. Follett was against imperialism, advocating for Ireland, Egypt, and Indian self-government. Follett was endorsed by Eugene Debs and W.D. Du Bois in the 1924 race for president. Follett would lose that election and died shortly after, in June 1925. Al Smith was the 1928 loser and the first Catholic nominated for president. Al Smith was involved in New York politics. In 1895, he investigated local corrupt Tammany Hall politicians. Smith was a member of the New York State Assembly from 1904 to 1915. During his time in the Assembly, he met with the families of the victims of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. These victims influenced his beliefs in supporting workers' rights and reforms for a safer workplace. Tammany Hall delivered the governorship to Smith. Al Smith became the governor of New York from 1919 to 1920 and 1923 to 28. As governor, he strengthened laws for compensation for workers, women, and children pensions. He ran for the Democratic nomination in 1924 as an Irish Catholic against Prohibition and against lynching, put him under the eye of the KKK during peak KKK membership of the United States. He lost the nomination in 1924, but got the nomination in 1928. After losing the election, he ran for nomination in 1932, but lost to FDR. Smith joined the American Liberty League, a conservative, democratic, anti-New Deal organization. He softened with time and eventually became more supportive of the Roosevelt administration.
First case of Budweiser beer to be delivered in the state of New York. Happy days are here again.
But for the first time since the Empire State was built, I got a real thrill when I saw the 6 big horses coming along with the wagon load of beer. The only regret I have is that it isn't all for me.
Al Smith became the president of the Empire State Inc., the company that built the Empire State Building. Smith, an Irish Catholic, decided to start construction of the Empire State Building on St. Patrick's Day, 1930. He became the president of the Board of Trustees of the University of Syracuse. In 1934, he became honorary night zookeeper for the Central Park Zoo. With the keys to the zoo, he would often take people to the zoo after hours. Smith opposed the Nazis and supported U.S. entry into World War II. He would die before the end of the war in 1944. Alf Landon, 1936 loser, was a Republican from Kansas. He started out as a banker, then eventually became a petroleum producer and supported Theodore Roosevelt's progressive run for president in 1912. He joined the Army during World War I, but didn't see combat. Became a private secretary to the governor of Kansas, then became an oil lobbyist. Landon became the chairman of the Kansas Republican Party. Landon became Kansas governor from 1933 to 1937. He ran for president in 1936 as a fiscal conservative, seeing the New Deal as too harsh on businesses and wasteful spending.
The time has come for a direct attack on the attempted Washington to substitute a tax-eating bureaucracy for a liberal democratic system. Business recovery offers more promise of employment than 1,000 wildcat schemes.
After the election, he went back to the oil industry, but stayed vocal in politics. He defended socialist Norman Thomas' First Amendment rights and was against Nazism and supported U.S. intervention in World War II. After being a fiscal conservative, he became less conservative in later years, supporting the Marshall Plan. He was one of the first people to advocate recognizing Mao Zedong as the rightful ruler of China, hoped to welcome China into the UN. He supported Medicare and LBJ's Great Society, and gave lectures at Kansas State University in 1966. He spoke at the 1976 Republican National Convention.
It's a great day in my life, and it's a great day in the life of all of us to have had the privilege that we have today of meeting the President of the United States.
Landon lived to be 100 years old and died in 1987. Wendell Willkie, 1940 loser. His father was a progressive William Jennings Bryan supporter. William Jennings Bryan even stayed in Willkie's childhood home in Indiana during the 1900 election. Willkie read Marx and petitioned for Indiana University to add a course of socialism. Willkie was a history teacher to help pay for law school. He was in the Army during World War I and became a lawyer and contemplated running as a Democrat for public office. Willkie was a delegate for the 1924 Democratic Convention, supporting Al Smith. Willkie led a successful effort to get rid of the Klan members of the Akron School Board. Willkie moved to New York City just before the Wall Street crash in 1929. Willkie was a delegate of the 1932 Democratic Convention. Willkie spoke out against the TVA and was now the voice of capitalist private electric power industry. Willkie became at odds with Roosevelt and voted for Alf Landon in 1936. In 1939, Willkie officially became a Republican and became the 1940 Republican nominee for president. Willkie was the big business candidate and supported aiding Britain in World War II, but he also called FDR a warmonger.
In the foreign policy of the United States, as in its domestic policy, I would do everything to defend American democracy, and I would refrain from doing anything that injured it.
After his defeat, he supported intervention in World War II, became a wartime advocate and Roosevelt supporter. He considered a run for New York governor in 1942 and even got the support of FDR. Willkie visited the Soviet Union, China, and the Middle East to represent the U.S. to show the U.S. as united in the war effort. He met with Joseph Stalin and Chiang Kai-shek.
But if we want to finish this war off with the minimum loss of lives, both of American and other boys on our side of the fight, then we must get aggressive. We must get on the offensive. And the best way to get on the offensive is by opening a second front someplace in Europe.
Willkie published a book called One World. The book was Anti-Colonialism and for a United Global Organization. In 1943, he was attempting the 1944 run for a Republican nomination, but after losing the nomination, he returned to law and died before the election even took place. Thomas Dewey, 1944-1948 loser. Dewey was a New York Republican, getting involved with party politics in the 1920s and 30s. Dewey was a prosecutor. He prosecuted bootlegger Wax Gordon. Dewey focused on breaking up the mafia and arresting its leaders. He went after Lucky Luciano for a prostitution racket in 1936. Dewey had arrested not just mafia members, he also arrested Richard Whitney, a former president of the stock exchange, James J. Hines, the political boss of Tammany Hall, and Fritz Jules Kahn, American Nazi. In 1938, he was elected governor of New York because of his record as a prosecutor. Dewey was a pay-as-you-go liberal. He supported the death penalty and passed the first state law that banned racial discrimination in employment. He also supported ending state funding of child care centers. He ran for the Republican nomination for presidency in 1940, but lost to Willkie. Dewey finally gained steam and won the nomination in 1948-4 as an interventionist and a liberal against a conservative isolationist, Robert Taft.
We can and will bring home 10 million heroes promptly after victory, home to an America with jobs and opportunity.
Dewey lost in 1944, but was re-nominated in 1948. Dewey seemed likely to win, but famously lost as Truman held up the newspaper. Dewey was governor of New York from 1943 to 54. He went back to New York after each of his defeats. He supported Eisenhower in 1952 against Dewey's rival Robert Taft. Thomas Dewey went back to his law practice after the end of his term as governor, remained a power broker in the Republican Party, supporting Nixon in 1960. As the conservative wing took over the party, he became less involved. In 1964, as a friend of Hubert Humphrey, Dewey helped Humphrey become LBJ's VP nominee. Dewey died in 1971. Strom Thurmond, 1948 loser, was a Southern Democrat from the birthplace of the Confederacy, South Carolina. In the 1930s, he was involved with law and politics in South Carolina, being a South Carolina state senator and state circuit judge. He resigned as judge during World War II to serve in the Army. He fought in the battles of Normandy in 1944. After the war, he came home and became a governor of South Carolina. After Harry Truman desegregated the armed forces while running for re-election in 1848, the angered segregationists who led Southern Democrats to split and form their own party, the Dixiecrats. As a Dixiecrat, Thurmond ran for president in 1948. In 1950, Strom Thurmond became a U.S. Senator. In the Senate, Thurmond co-wrote the Southern Manifesto, denouncing Brown v. Board decision. In 1957, he filibustered for 24 hours against the Civil Rights Bill. In the Senate, Thurmond became a big opponent of the Kennedy administration policies on civil rights.
This bill is intended to appease those waging a vicious campaign of civil disobedience. The leaders of the demonstrations have already stated that passage of the bill will not stop the mobs.
Thurmond became a Republican and campaigned for Barry Goldwater, part of the right-wing Southern takeover of the Republican Party. Thurmond was a part of a backroom deal to help Nixon win the 1968 Republican nomination, despite the fact that Thurmond supported Reagan. Thurmond campaigned for Nixon, saying that voting for George Wallace would split the vote and let Humphrey win. So we must vote for Nixon, he says. Thurmond was close with the Nixon presidency and was one of the few to support him during the Watergate scandal. In 1975, Thurmond was one of 4 senators that voted against investigating the CIA and FBI. Thurmond was an anti-communist hardliner, supporting the war in Vietnam and defending William Calley and the My Lai massacre. In 1980, Thurmond campaigned vigorously for Reagan, finally a chance for him to get true right-wing Republican and staunch anti-communist intervention in the White House. Thurmond attempted to overturn Roe v. Wade and failed in 1982. He stayed as an old man in the Senate until 2003. At the age of 100, he resigned and died shortly after. Hadley Stevenson, 1952 and 1956 loser. Stevenson is part of a famous Illinois Democrat dynasty. His grandfather was Grover Cleveland's vice president, and his family held a lot of positions of power. Hadley was raised in Bloomington, Illinois. He started out as a special attorney and assistant to Jerome Frank. When Prohibition ended, Stevenson became chief attorney for the Federal Alcohol Control Administration. He returned to law in Chicago in 1935. He became chairman of a Chicago organization focused on raising money for the Allies in World War II. In 1940, he became a special assistant and principal attorney for the Secretary of the Navy. In 1944, he went to Sicily to report on Italy's economy. He was involved in international meetings and eventually became involved with the creation of the United Nations. After the creation of the UN, he went home and became governor of Illinois. being governor from 1949 to 53. As governor, Stevenson reformed the state police to be employed based on merit instead of being politically appointed. Stevenson wanted to improve Illinois state constitution. In 1949, he was a character witness for Alger Hiss. In 1952, Stevenson met with President Truman. Truman told Stevenson that Truman would not run, and he wanted Stevenson to run for president. Stevenson became the nominee for the Democratic Party. After losing, he went on a world tour throughout Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. In 1954, Stevenson campaigned for Democrats across the nation. He was more involved and active for the campaign for the presidency in 1956. In the 1956 campaign, he participated in the first televised primary debate.
What is America about? What does it mean in this midpoint of the 20th century, when these great revolutions of technology that have developed this bomb, which have made all men neighbors?
Stevenson was not a strong supporter of civil rights, urging caution to not scare away white Southerners from the party. In 1956, he only got 61% of the black vote, a low for New Deal Democrats. Stevenson, after losing the election, went back to his law practice. For the 1960 Democratic Convention, he wanted the nomination but didn't want a campaign and was hoping to make some backroom deals to be president. But Kennedy became the nominee and Stevenson campaigned for him. Kennedy appointed Stevenson as the U.S. ambassador to the UN. He supported U.S. foreign policy. He heard rumors of a planned invasion for Cuba, but he claimed it was only rumors, leading to the most embarrassing moment when the Bay of Pigs invasion happened. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, he forcefully asked the Soviets if they had missiles in Cuba.
Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sights in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no. I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over.
Stevenson stayed as UN ambassador after the Kennedy assassination, staying and supporting Johnson's policy in Vietnam. Stevenson was an interventionist believing in the domino theory and the need to contain communism. Stevenson died in 1965. Barry Goldwater, 1964 loser, was in the Army Air Force during World War II. After the war, he joined the Arizona National Guard. Goldwater became friends with Herbert Hoover. Goldwater was a staunch conservative, anti-New Deal, anti-union. He rebuilt the Arizona Republican Party and was instrumental in electing Howard Powell as governor in 1950. In 1952, he ran for the Senate. In the Senate, he became a critic of Eisenhower, seeing him as too liberal of a Republican and who compromised with the Democrats too much. Despite not being personally racist, he voted against civil rights and opposed the Brown v. Board decision. As MLK Jr. said, while not himself a racist, Mr. Goldwater articulates a philosophy which gives aid and comfort to racists.
Minority groups run this country, and just face up to it.
Goldwater was a favorite son of Arizona in the 1960 Republican Convention. The Arizona delegation voted for Goldwater but changed their vote to Nixon to make the nomination unanimous. Goldwater was the face of the conservative wing of the party, wanting to privatize Social Security. Despite being against the federal government, interventions in doing good things like civil rights help the poor and aged, he supported the evils of the federal government, supporting the American empire's interventions. Not only was he a war hawk, he supported using nukes as conventional weapons. Goldwater was the man who sparked the realignment in the political parties. His beliefs were welcomed by the white South. After fighting against the establishment Republicans, he won the nomination and lost in a landslide to LBJ.
Not to stagnate in the swampland of collectivism, not to cringe before the bullying of communism.
Goldwater returned to the Senate, where he was the face of the conservative takeover of the Republican Party. During Watergate, Goldwater led a delegation of senators that convinced Nixon to resign. In 1975 Church Committee, Goldwater was a Republican member investigating the CIA and FBI. for assassinations around the world and spying on American citizens. During the 1976 campaign, he blocked Nelson Rockefeller's VP nomination. Goldwater was opposed to normalizing relations with China, played a part in fighting to ratify the Panama Canal Treaty, returning the canal to Panama. Goldwater in the 1980s came at odds with the religious conservative supporters by upholding legal abortion. In the 1980s, the Goldwater wing finally took over the presidency with Ronald Reagan. Goldwater became chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He was against the CIA putting sea mines on the coast of Nicaragua without congressional approval. He supported Reagan, but still saw Iran-Contra as a stupid blunder. Goldwater retired from the Senate in 1987. Goldwater now saw himself as out of touch with the Republican Party, seeing himself as now more liberal than the majority of the Republican Party. In retirement, he still was vocal. He supported gay service in the military, and in 1996 he met with the Republican candidate Bob Dole saying, "We're the new liberals of the Republican Party." Could you imagine that? Goldwater died in 1998. The 1968 loser. What's his name again?
We have a great man who should have been president and who would have been one of the greatest presidents in history, Hubert Horatio Hornbull. Humphrey!
Hubert Humphrey, the 1968 loser, Democrat from Minnesota, started out in the 1930s helping his dad run a pharmacy. Humphrey became a doctoral student at the University of Minnesota and was a supervisor for the Worker Progress Administration. During World War II, Humphrey was assistant director of the War Manpower Commission. Humphrey became a political science professor and a news commentator for a local radio station. Humphrey was an anti-communist and anti-radical who purged the DFL of its radical elements, using Americans for Democratic Action to force them out of political life, bringing liberals in power of the party. Humphrey was mayor in Minneapolis from 1945 to 48. In 1948, Humphrey was part of a coalition for the Democratic Convention that sought to add civil rights to the party plank. That would have the Democratic Party committed to end segregation. After this, he ran for the Senate, becoming a senator from 1949 to 64. In the Senate, he supported civil rights, and he backed Truman's anti-communist measure. He supported locking up subversives without trial, and to make being a member of the Communist Party a felony. Humphrey introduced a bill to create the Peace Corps. In the Senate, he was an advocate for the nuclear test ban, civil rights, foreign aid, and food stamps. For the presidential elections, Humphrey was mentioned in 1952. He was a part of the race for vice president in 1956. In 1960, he ran for the presidential nomination, but lost to fellow VP candidate from 1956, JFK. In 1961, he became the majority whip in the Senate, playing a pivotal role in passing the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
Right to vote for all of our people, and it will give us the means to make possible the admittance to schoolrooms of children regardless of their race. And it will make sure that no American will have to suffer the indignity of being refused service at a public place.
He was running to hope to be that vice president. LBJ chose Humphrey after the election. Then after the election, Humphrey became vice president from 1965 to 69. Humphrey was a Vietnam skeptic, but LBJ would give Humphrey the cold shoulder until Humphrey gave in and stayed loyal to the president. Humphrey supported civil rights as the vice president and took trips around the world. After LBJ was forced to drop out in the 1968 campaign, LBJ backed Hubert Humphrey, famously saying behind doors, "I got his pecker in my pocket." Humphrey was seen as too loyal to LBJ, supporting the administration's actions of the Vietnam War, staying too close to the administration until it was too late and losing the 1968 election.
It'll be a close fight. Come see, come saw, you know, one way, it bounced a little one way, bounced a little another.
After he served his term as vice president, he went back to teach at the University of Minnesota and McAllister College, became chairman of the board of Encyclopedia Britannica, came back to the Senate from 1971 to 78. In 1972, he attempted to run for president, but lost the Democratic nomination. He wanted Walter Mondale to run for 1976, but instead Jimmy Carter was the nominee, and Humphrey supported him. Humphrey supported the Carter administration in the Senate until Humphrey died in 1978. George Wallace was another 1968 loser for the American Independent Party. In 1946, he became a member of the Alabama State House from 46 to 1955. He opposed Truman's desegregating the armed forces, but didn't join the Dixiecrats, staying loyal to the Democratic Party. In 1952, he became a circuit judge. Wallace was a believer in segregation. He was the first Southern judge to prevent the removal of segregation signs in front of rail terminals. He lost his race for governor in 1958 because he was seen as too moderate of a racist. He ran again in 1962, this time running as a stricter segregationist, being even more racist. Wallace's first term as governor was from 1963 to 67.
Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
His new speech writer was a Klansman, Asa Carter. Wallace famously stood out in front of the University of Alabama to prevent integration. He was against integration and explained his actions when he said, "The president wants us to surrender the state to Martin Luther King and his pro-communists who have instigated these demonstrations." In November 1963, Wallace announced his run for the presidency with the hope to primary JFK. JFK, of course, famously would respond to this by going to one of the most important southern swing states, Texas, to campaign, where of course he got assassinated. After the assassination, Wallace was continued to run. And in 1966, he was term limited. He ran his wife as governor, and she won, being first gentleman during 1967 to 68, in which he ran for president for the 1968 election. In the election, he ran as a tough on crime, segregationist, anti-communism, anti-hippie, and demanded American allies to pay more.
Mr. Nixon and Mr. Humphrey both, in recorded statements, said, "It is a great movement. It is a great lie-in. It is a great demonstration. It is a great sit-in." And now it's culminated in anarchy throughout the country, and now they come along and tell you that we recommended it, but now we're going to save you by calling for law and order.
In 1970, he was able to run for governor of Alabama again, becoming governor from 71 to 79, and almost immediately started running for the presidency in 1972, but this time as a Democrat. While campaigning for the presidency, he had an attempt on his life. He was shot 4 times. In the hospital, he was visited by presidential primary rival, Shirley Chisholm, wheelchair-bound for the rest of his life. Again, Wallace ran for the 1976 election, then dropped out and endorsed Jimmy Carter. In the 1980s, Wallace claimed to be born again and apologized for his racist beliefs, and running for a 3rd term, becoming governor from 1983 to 87. After his governorship, he retired and became a Republican, voted for Bush in 92 and Dole in 1996, and Wallace died in 1998. George McGovern, 1972 loser, was from South Dakota. He grew up during the Great Depression and Dust Bowl. He was inspired by New Deal-era populism. After Pearl Harbor, he volunteered to join the Army Air Force, serving in World War II in the European theater. Thanks to the GI Bill, McGovern was able to get a PhD at Northwestern University. In 1948, McGovern supported the progressive third-party campaign of Henry Wallace. In 1952, McGovern dedicated himself to the Stevenson campaign. And then in 1956, McGovern first ran for political office, becoming a South Dakota member of the House of Representatives from 1957 to 61. McGovern supported accepting China into the UN. He was in the House Committee on Education and Labor. In Congress, he became close with the Kennedy family. When Kennedy became president, McGovern was appointed as the first director of Food for Peace to provide food assistance around the world. In 1962, he ran for the Senate. He became a senator from 1963 to 81. In the Senate, he supported peace with Cuba, being against America's Castro fixation. He voted for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which he would go on to regret. By January 1965, he was opposed to the U.S. war in Vietnam, but voted for equipping the soldiers, believing in protecting the troops, but still wanted them out. McGovern was cautious during the 1968 primary, but eventually decided to run 2 weeks before the convention in Chicago. After the disastrous 68 primary, McGovern led a committee that changed the way the Democratic Party chose a candidate. No longer can party bosses pick their candidates, and it also got rid of the influence of unions on the party, which would eventually lead to the more modern Democratic Party. Unfortunately, that's less economically progressive. At least the party candidate would be chosen by a national election. McGovern continued to speak out against the war and in 1971 announced to run for president. In the 1972 campaign, he ran a grassroots small donor campaign and won cut defense spending and end the war. He also supported universal income, giving all Americans $1,000.
And you stay there till you rot. Why isn't there places like this that the government could set up? Nobody thinks of a disabled veteran or a disabled anybody but another disabled person.
That there are people who are desperately in need of help that can't qualify for it under the present system.
To stay alive.
That's right. I love the United States, but I love it enough so I want to see some changes made. The American people want to believe in their government. They want to believe in their country. And I'd like to be one of those that provides the kind of leadership that would help restore that kind of faith. I don't say I can do it alone. Of course I can't. But the president can help set a new tone in this country. He can help raise the vision and the faith and the hope of the American people.
After losing the election, McGovern went back to the Senate. He led the Congress to refuse to send more aid to South Vietnam after the fall of Saigon. In 1977, he was focused on American nutrition, hoping to make American health healthy and to combat leading causes in death like diabetes and heart disease. McGovern supported abortion, which led to him being targeted by a right-wing majority PAC. He lost to Republicans James Ander in 1980. In 1981, McGovern became a historian at the University of New Orleans. In 1984, McGovern attempted to run for the Democratic nomination, but again dropped out early on. In 1988, he began to run a 150-room inn in Connecticut. You know what you're thinking? That sounds a lot like the plot to the 80s sitcom Newhart. Well, guess what? McGovern actually showed up on an episode of Newhart.
He wants to get your autograph. He's a liberal. Really? He looks like a shallow, self-centered, materialistic yuppie to me.
In 1992, McGovern became president of the Middle East Policy Council. In 1998, McGovern was appointed as U.S. Ambassador to the UN Agency of Food and Agriculture from 1998 to 2001, creating a plan to reduce the number of hungry people in half in 2015, calling for more surplus for foreign school lunch programs. McGovern worked with Senator Bob Dole to expand school lunches and food stamps, help pregnant women and poor children. This helped provide 22 million meals to 41 countries in 8 years. For this, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2000. In 2001, McGovern was appointed the first UN Global Ambassador on World Hunger and remained vocal in politics and opposed the Iraq War. In 2008, he called for the impeachment of Bush and Cheney, and he later endorsed Obama's run for the presidency. In 2011, McGovern wrote a letter to Obama on what progressive policies Obama should support in the second term, calling for a removal of all troops from Afghanistan, closing all U.S. Middle East bases, cut the defense spending, spend money on creating a high-speed rail network. McGovern later died in 2012. John B. Anderson, the 1980 loser. Anderson was a Republican from Illinois. He started out at law school, but had his education interrupted by World War II. He served in the Army during the war, and after the war he started participating in law in Rockford, Illinois. In 1956, he was elected to State's Attorney of Winnebago County, and after winning five-way primary for the Republican nomination for Illinois 16th District, he was elected to the House of Representatives, serving 10 terms from 1961 to 1981. From the early 1960s, Anderson was one of the most conservative members of the House and even introduced a constitutional amendment that recognized the law and authority of Jesus Christ over the United States. He would come to regret this. In the House, his social positions would shift to the left, voting for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 68, the Voting Rights Act, and in favor of creation of HUD. And he supported the constitutional amendment to lower the voting age to 18. In 1969, Anderson became the chairman of the House Republican Conference. He was critical of Nixon over Watergate. Anderson was an ally to Gerald Ford. When Ford lost in 1976, he was left without his main ally. He decided to run as a Republican in the 1980 election, running for a 50-cent tax on gasoline, 50% cut in Social Security payroll tax, and then on social issues, he was very liberal, supporting the ERA, gay rights, abortion rights, and opposed requirement of a military draft.
And I must confess to this audience that I am not a younger Ronald Reagan with experience. I am younger, yes, but I do not share his view of the world. He was opposed to the SALT II agreement even before the invasion of Afghanistan. He was opposed to the Panama Canal treaties. He takes a view of the economy that I think pretty much goes back to the time of Adam Smith and the invisible hand. He doesn't see a genuine role for the federal government when it comes to advancing the cause of human rights or civil rights in this country. And I think really most of his ideas would take us back.
The new right was on the rise, and Anderson would not have a place in the new Reagan Republican Party. The Republican Party refused to support the Equal Rights Amendment, which led to Anderson leaving the party and running as an independent. His campaign was supported by the creator of All in the Family and most other sitcoms worth watching, Norman Lear. After the election, Anderson would leave the Republican Party for good, becoming a visiting professor for many colleges across the country. In 1984, he endorsed Walter Mondale, and in 1989, Anderson became the first executive director of the Council for National Interests. In 1992, Anderson helped form the Fair Vote an advocacy group with a liberal tint. In 2000, Anderson endorsed Ralph Nader, and in 2008, he endorsed Obama. He helped to create the Justice Party in 2012. Then in 2014, he endorsed the UN's Parliamentary Assembly. In 2017, at 95, John Anderson died. Mondale, 1984 loser, graduated from the University of Minnesota in 1951. Then joined the Army. After the Army, he went to law school and was a volunteer for the campaign of Hubert Humphrey for mayor of Minneapolis. Mondale became a campaigner in Minneapolis and supported Humphrey's run for the Senate. Mondale is seen as a first-rate political strategist. In 1960, Mondale was appointed Minnesota Attorney General. As Attorney General, he helped to establish a separate consumer protection, antitrust, and civil rights units. Mondale expanded the legal authority of the Attorney General, and he helped to influence the Supreme Court in the Gideon v. Wainwright case, which established the right to receive court-appointed counsel. Mondale was a member of the President's Consumer Advisory Council, 1960-64, and in the 1964 DNC, he brokered a compromise between segregationists and the Freedom Democratic Party, prohibited segregated delegations. Hubert Humphrey became vice president, leaving his Senate seat open. Mondale was appointed to Humphrey's seat. In that seat, Mondale became a strong supporter of the Great Society, supporting civil rights, economic and education, consumer protections, and then Mondale introduced the Fair Warning Act of 1966, which forced automakers to inform car owners of safety defects. Mondale strengthened government regulations and oversight. Mondale helped pass the Fair Housing Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1968. He supported his Minnesota friend Hubert Humphrey for president, became chairman of the Select Committee for Equal Education Opportunity, fighting for integrating schools and recommending programs. He supported special education projects projects, educational television, and bilingual education. He introduced a child care bill that was vetoed by Nixon, and then Mondale became a rising star in the Democratic Party after the Congressional Budget Act of 1974. In 1975, Mondale was a member of the Church Committee to investigate the FBI, CIA.
If you're going to continue what you're now doing, and as I understand it, you still insist you did the right thing with the Vietnam Veterans Against the War and investigating the Council of Churches. So
No.
This can still go on. This can still go on under your interpretation of your present powers, which you try to justify on the grounds of your law enforcement activities in terms of criminal matters.
The law does not say we have to wait until we have been murdered before we can act.
Absolutely. But that's in the
but
field of law again.
that's
There you
right.
go again.
Mondale was seen as a potential candidate for 1976, but decided not to run. Instead, he became the VP nominee and became vice president from 1977 to 81. As vice president, he participated in the selection of cabinet members and other officials. Mondale's biggest accomplishment was opening the discussion with Malcolm Reagan and Anwar Sadat, leading to the Camp David Accords. Mondale was a supporter of digitalized imperialism, supporting cruise missiles and Predator aircrafts. After Jimmy Carter lost re-election in 1980, Mondale became a public consultant and joined a local law firm. Then he went on to run for the presidency in 1984.
Now, the example that the president cites has nothing to do with abortion. Somebody went to a woman and nearly killed her. That's always been a serious crime, and always should be a serious crime. But how does that compare with the problem of a woman who's raped? Do we really want those decisions made by judges who've been picked because they will agree to find the person guilty? I don't think so, and I think it's going in exactly the wrong direction.
After losing, he went back to Minnesota, joining the Minneapolis law firm. And then he became ambassador to Japan from 1993 to 96. Mondale co-chaired the Institute Campaign Finance Reform Project from 1997 to 98. After Paul Wellstone died, Mondale replaced Wellstone as the DFL candidate in 2002, but lost to the Republican candidate. After that, he became a member of law firms and corporate boards, encouraged Al Franken to run for Senate, remained vocal, and famously criticized Vice President Dick Cheney.
And he worked with some of his key guys to bring about the torture memo and so on. I think those were bad days in the history of the vice president.
Mondale endorsed Amy Klobuchar for president 2019. Mondale died in 2021. Michael Dukakis, the 1988 loser. In 1955, Dukakis graduated from college as a political science major. After college, he joined the Army and served in the UN delegation of the Military Armistice Commission. In 1960, he got his degree from Harvard, and then Dukakis served in local politics as a Massachusetts House member. In 1974, Dukakis ran for governor. He won and then became governor of Massachusetts from 1975 to 1979. In 1976, he spoke at the DNC. Dukakis was primaried and lost to Edward King. After losing his governorship, Dukakis taught at Harvard and published a book called State and Cities, the Massachusetts Experiment. In 1982, Dukakis ran again for governor and won a second term. The second term was from 1983 to 1991. Governor, he appeared in episodes of Cheers and Saint Elsewhere. His second term was more memorable and seen as more favorable. Dukakis presided over the Massachusetts economic growth, known as the Massachusetts Miracle. A tech boom helped the state's economy and he improved Massachusetts public transit and often took the subway to work as governor. In 1988, he used the Massachusetts Miracle to run for president.
Saying, "Governor, I need help. We're providing that young woman with help, but I want to be a president of the United States who makes sure that we never again do business with a drug-running Panamanian dictator, that we never again funnel aid to the Contras who convicted drug dealers."
After being defeated by Bush in 1988, he remained as governor but lost his popularity, deciding not to run for re-election in 1989. In the 90s, Dukakis became a member of the board of Amtrak and a political science professor at Northeastern University. He helped form the Next Generation Initiative, which aimed to get students involved in public affairs. In 2009, Dukakis was mentioned as a possible replacement for Senator Ted Kennedy after Kennedy died. Dukakis stayed vocal on politics, supporting a high-speed rail system to fix American traffic congestion. Dukakis supported Elizabeth Warren's run for the Senate as well as her 2020 run for president. Dukakis still makes media appearances and is the last living loser of the 20th century. Ross Perot, the 1992-1996 loser. The Texas businessman who started out in the U.S. Navy from 1953 to 57. In 57, Perot became a salesman for IBM. Then in 1962, he founded the company Electric Data Systems. In 1969, he visited Laos and became involved with POW-MI myth that the Nixon administration created. Perot engaged in backroom deals with Vietnamese officials, and when the war ended, he still believed that troops were being held there. Perot worked with the Reagan and H.W. Bush government to hopefully bring back these troops that weren't there. He believed in the POW-MI myth, and that the U.S. government was covering it up. Perot opposed the Bush administration war in Iraq, and in 1992 he ran an independent campaign for president and ran as an outsider. He was portrayed as a kook. He ran interesting little populist ads on TV, and then Perot went on the first debate between three parties.
I want all the children, I want these young people up here to be able to start with nothing but an idea like I did and build a business. But they've got to have a strong basic economy, and if you're in debt, it's like having a ball and chain around you. I just figure, as lucky as I've been, I owe it to them. And I owe it to the future generations, and on a very personal basis, I owe it to my children and grandchildren.
In the 1990s, he continued speaking out against NAFTA. He debated Al Gore on Larry King Live in 1993, and in 1995, Perot helped found the Reform Party, and was the party's nominee for the 1996 election.
We count on the two political parties to solve these problems? They are the problem, right?
He didn't support the Reform Party, becoming a Republican in 2000 and endorsing George W. Bush. In 2008, he opposed John McCain, supporting Mitt Romney for the 2008 Republican primary. He supported Mitt Romney again in 2012, then Perot was quiet in 2016, publicly endorsing anyone, and died at the age of 89 in 2019. Bob Dole, the 1996 loser, was a Republican from Kansas. Dole started in the Army, serving in Europe during World War II, then came back in 1950, becoming a member of the Kansas State House. In 1960, Dole was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. Dole voted in support for the Civil Rights Act and voted to lower the voting age to 18. Dole voted against Medicare, Medicaid, and the Fair Housing Act. He voted against food stamps and federal aid to education. In 1968, Dole ran as a senator representing the state of Kansas, becoming a senator from 1969 to 1996. Dole became a spokesman for agriculture in the Senate. Dole was the right wing of the Republican Party. Dole backed the war in Vietnam and supported Nixon's presidency. Dole even talked down Watergate as not big of an issue. When the right wing became a problem for President Ford, he picked Bob Dole as the vice presidential candidate in 1976. Dole participated in the first VP debate against Walter Mondale.
Of the war in Korea, all Democrat wars, all in this century, if we added up the killed and wounded in Democrat wars in this century, it'd be about 1.6 million Americans, enough to fill the city of Detroit. Now, if we want to go back and rake that over and over and over, we can do that. I assume Senator Mondale doesn't want to do that. But it seems to me that the pardon of Richard Nixon is behind us. Watergate's behind us. If we have this vision for America, and if we're really concerned about those people out there and their problems, yes, and their education and their jobs, we ought to be talking about that.
I think Senator Dole has richly earned his reputation as a hatchet man tonight.
by implying and stating that World War II and the Korean War were democratic wars. Does he really mean to suggest to the American people that there was a partisan difference over our involvement in the war to fight Nazi Germany?
Then Dole, after the election, Dole returned to the Senate. Dole ran for president in 1980, but quickly returned to the Senate. He became leader of the Republicans in the Senate from 1985 to 1996. Dole ran again for the Republican nomination in 1988. Tough campaign against Vice President Bush.
And Senator Dole, is there anything you'd like to say to the Vice President?
Yeah, stop lying about my record.
After the midterm election in 1994, Dole became the Senate Majority Leader for the last time, 1995 to 96. He became the obstructionist and played part in the government shutdown of 1995 and 96. After his loss, Dole left the Senate, and in 1997 started making TV appearances on Letterman, SNL, and Suddenly Susan. Dole became a spokesman for Pepsi, Visa, Dunkin' Donuts, and Viagra.
Erectile dysfunction, ED, often called impotence. You know, it's a little embarrassing to talk about ED, but it's so important to millions of men and their partners.
Then he became a lobbyist for foreign governments and was labeled as a foreign agent, representing the governments of Kosovo, Taiwan, and Slovenia. Dole criticized Newt Gingrich during the 2012 Republican primary for president. Dole was the only living Republican nominee who endorsed Donald Trump in 2016. He helped campaign for Trump and helped his transition team. Dole supported Trump's re-election in 2020, then died a year later in 2021. Al Gore, the 2000 loser, the first loser of the 21st century, was the son of Al Gore Sr., the Tennessee politician. Jr. went on to college at Harvard and was roommates with future actor Tommy Lee Jones. Al Gore served in the Army from 1969 to 71 during the Vietnam War. After the war, Gore became an investigative reporter for the Tennessean. In 1976, Al Gore ran for his father's old seat in the House. Gore, now in the House of Representatives from 1977 to 1985. Al Gore was a middle-of-the-road moderate. He opposed homosexuality in the 1980s, opposed federal funding of abortion. Then in 1984, Gore ran for the Senate, becoming senator from 1985 to 93. Gore was an Atari Democrat that supported technology investments and was a proponent of protecting the environment. Gore introduced the Supercomputer Network Study Act. Gore ran for the Democratic nomination for the presidency in 1988. After losing the nomination, Al Gore's son was run over by a car. This accident was a factor in not running for president in 1992. Al Gore created the High Performance Computing Act of 1991 and voted against the nomination for Clarence Thomas. Gore was one of 10 Democrats in the Senate to vote for the Gulf War. Al Gore was nominated as Bill Clinton's VP in 1992. Winning the election, Gore became vice president from 1993 to 2001. He had a close working relationship with the president, played a part in the administration's climate goals, negotiating and supporting the Kyoto Protocol. The vice president ran for the presidency in 2000.
The key question that has to be answered in this election is, will we use that prosperity wisely in a way that benefits all of our people and doesn't go just to the few? Almost half of all the tax cut benefits, as I said, under Governor Bush's plan, go to the wealthiest 1%.
After the controversial election that the Supreme Court decided, Gore accepted the decision and conceded. Gore became a critic of the Bush administration, speaking out against the Iraq War. Gore opened 2004 DNC, and despite many efforts, refused to run for president. Gore founded Generational Investment Management, a sustainable investment firm. He became an active environmentalist in 2006. He created a documentary called Inconvenient Truth. He became more involved in the entertainment industry, appearing in episodes of Futurama and 30 Rock.
Quiet. A whale is in trouble. I have to go.
Gore continued speaking engagements, talking about climate change and supporting Democratic candidates for president. Kerry, 2004 loser. Kerry served in the Navy during the Vietnam War. and returned to the States in 1970, joining Veterans Against the War. In 1971, he appeared in front of Congress denouncing the war.
And who were given the chance to die for the biggest nothing in history. Men who have returned with a sense of anger and a sense of betrayal.
In 1972, he unsuccessfully ran for the House. Then, while studying law, Kerry became a talk radio host and spent time fundraising for Cooperative for Assistance and Relief Everywhere. In 1977, Kerry became the first assistant district attorney. Kerry again worked as a commentator, and he co-founded a bakery. In the 1982 election, he became Dukakis's lieutenant governor of Massachusetts from 1983 to 85. After serving as lieutenant governor, he became a senator from 1985 to 2013. Kerry was a prosecutor during the Iran-Contra affair, and as senator, he appeared in an episode of Cheers.
You know, but they ought to get you for 60 minutes as an anchor.
No, I'm John Kerry, Senator Kerry, from Massachusetts.
Our senator. I'm sorry, man. I'm so sorry. Sorry to bother you.
Sorry to bother you, but...
Kerry spoke at the 1996 DNC, and in 2000 he was in the running to be Gore's VP. Kerry voted for the Iraq War, but later became a critic of the war, which made him seen as a flip-flopper in the 2004 campaign. Kerry ran as a moderate and lost the election.
Smart means not diverting your attention from the real war on terror in Afghanistan against Osama bin Laden and taking it off to Iraq, where the 9/11 Commission confirms there was no connection to 9/11 itself in Saddam Hussein, and where the reason for going to war was weapons of mass destruction, not the removal of Saddam Hussein.
After the election, he established a PAC focused on Democrats regaining power and change a disastrous course in Iraq. In 2008, he endorsed Obama, and in the 2012 election, he impersonated Mitt Romney to help Obama debate Pratt. After the election, Obama appointed John Kerry as Secretary of State from 2013 to 2017. As Secretary of State, he spoke out against Israel, calling it an apartheid state, but he was quickly made to apologize for the statement.
If the choice is one state, Israel can either be Jewish or democratic. It cannot be both.
Kerry then played a role in the Iran nuclear deal and opened relations with Cuba, becoming the first U.S. Secretary of State to have met with Iran counterparts since 1979 and first to go to Cuba since 1945. John Kerry supported the Saudi Arabian genocidal war in Yemen. Then after the Obama administration, Kerry became a Trump critic and took part in the 2017 Women's March. In 2019, Kerry endorsed an old friend from the Senate, Joe Biden, for the presidency. Biden appointed John Kerry as climate envoy. He went to climate meetings and met with world leaders, cooperation with China, India, and the Middle East. John Kerry stepped down in March 2024, but plans to stay active in the climate financial space. He stepped down to work on the Biden campaign and then the Harris campaign that replaced it. John McCain, 2008 loser, was a Republican born in the Panama Canal Zone. McCain is from a military family and was in the Navy during the Vietnam War. He took part in Operation Rolling Thunder and was captured as a POW by the North Vietnamese. McCain returned to America as part of Nixon's PR victory of Operation Homecoming. In 1976, McCain campaigned for Reagan. McCain stayed involved in the military until 1981 as a Navy liaison to the Senate. In 1982, ran for the House of Representatives, became a House of Representative member from 1983 to 87. One of the first things he did in the House was oppose the creation of MLK Day. In 1987, McCain took over another loser, Barry Goldwater's old Senate seat. McCain became senator for Arizona from 1987 to 2018. In the Senate, he supported cutting non-military spending, supported Robert Bork's nomination in the Supreme Court. In 1988, McCain spoke at the RNC. McCain was a war hawk. He supported the invasion of his birth country, Panama, in 1989, but he did oppose the 1993 invasion of Somalia, though it was mainly because it was too expensive. McCain supported impeachment of Bill Clinton and voted to convict him. McCain supported the Kosovo War. He wrote his memoirs as a way to run for president in 2000. McCain lost the nomination to George W. Bush. McCain supported a bipartisan election reforms. McCain helped to create the 9/11 Commission to investigate what happened on September 11, 2001. McCain co-sponsored climate legislation in 2004, supporting Bush for re-election. McCain was against the Bush tax cuts when they passed, but supported the tax cuts in 2006. McCain ran in 2008.
And it was sponsored by Bush and Cheney. You know who voted for it? You might never know. That one. You know who voted against it? Me. I have fought time after time against these pork barrel, these bills that come to the floor, and they have all kinds of goodies and all kinds of things in them for everybody, and they buy off the votes. I vote against them, my friends.
And then after losing the election, McCain returned to the Senate and led the opposition to Obama. He criticized Obama for not being hawkish enough in Afghanistan, and in 2010, McCain opposed the Affordable Care Act. McCain supported Arizona SB 1070, one of the most strictest laws on undocumented immigrants, requiring 14-year-old foreigners in the country that were there for more than 30 days to be registered by the government and must have documentation at all times and could be stopped at any time.
And complete the dang fence.
It'll work this time. Senator, you're one of us.
McCain supported U.S. intervention in Libya and supported Mitt Romney's run in 2012. McCain opposed Obama's normalizing relations with Cuba. McCain supported the Saudi Arabian genocidal war in Yemen. Then McCain became a critic of Trump, but said he was going to support him as the candidate of the Republican Party. McCain supported Trump's arms deal with Saudi Arabia, as well as supported Trump's tax cuts. McCain cast the deciding vote to not repeal the Affordable Care Act, despite being against it, mainly because he saw it as political suicide for the Republican Party to get rid of Obamacare. In 2018, McCain died. Romney, the 2012 loser, was the son of George Romney, the man who failed to be nominated as a Republican candidate for the presidency in 1964 and 68. Mitt formed his own private equity firm, Bain Capital. Mitt Romney was also president of Boston Stake of the Mormon Church. In 1994, he challenged Ted Kennedy in the Senate race. He was a Republican Mormon running against the Democrat Kennedy in Massachusetts. He obviously lost. Mitt Romney was a part in organizing in the 2002 Paralympic Winter Games in Salt Lake City. Romney wrote a book about this experience, which he used to help boost his PR. And in 2002, he ran to be Massachusetts governor. He won, becoming governor from 2003 to 2007. As governor, he cut spending and raised taxes. He increased fees on gun, hunting, and driving licenses. Despite being a Republican, Romney pushed for statewide healthcare reform. A similar law would be passed federally as Obamacare. Romney was against gay marriage and attempted to ban them. In 2004, Romney spoke at RNC. In 2007, he announced his run for president, and in the 2008 Republican primary, Mitt Romney came third. After 2008, he spent most of his time running for 2012. He opposed bailout of the automotive industry, that instead they should have went through a managed bankruptcy. He served on the board of directors of Marriott International. Then in 2012, he got the nomination.
What we've seen over the last 4 years is something I don't want to see over the next 4 years. The president said by now we'd be at 5.4% unemployment. We're 9 million jobs short of that.
He lost the election, being seen too much as elitist, and he returned to Marriott International. Mitt and his family moved to Utah in 2014. Mitt was considering a run for president in 2016, but the Republican establishment backed Jeb Bush. Romney could not face off against Bush donors. In 2018, Mitt Romney ran for Utah Senator, becoming a senator in 2019. Mitt Romney became a critic of Trump, being a lone Republican to vote to convict Trump during the first Trump impeachment. Romney also voted to convict Trump during the second impeachment in 2021. Mitt Romney, being unfit and unwelcome in the Trump Republican Party, announced he would not run for re-election in 2024 and plans on retiring from the Senate in 2025. Hillary Clinton, the 2016 loser, is the wife of former President Bill Clinton. In 1974, she was a member of the impeachment inquiry staff during Watergate. She got married to Bill a year later, being First Lady of Arkansas during Bill Clinton's time as governor from 1979 to 81 and 83 to 92. During her time as First Lady of Arkansas, she continued practicing law. She was a chair member of the New World Foundation. She then campaigned for her husband's run for president, becoming First Lady of America in 1993 to 2001. As First Lady, she was one of the most vocal and involved First Ladies. Clinton's biggest achievement was being chair of the Task Force on National Health Care Reform. It was a plan to bring about universal health care that failed. She also played a role in passing Children's Health Insurance Program, CHIP.
That eventually we are all going to die.
Under the Clinton health plan? You mean after Bill and Hillary put all those new bureaucrats and taxes on us, we're still all gonna die?
She also supported women's rights internationally. However, this support for women's rights is what is critically called imperial feminism, a more modern view of white man's burden, supporting U.S. imperial adventures overseas as a way to civilize the third world and bring women's rights to the misogynistic savages. After Bill Clinton's term was over, Hillary ran for the Senate in 2000, becoming a New York Senator from 2001 to 2009. Clinton voted for the war in Afghanistan, the Patriot Act, and the Iraq War.
Reports show that Saddam Hussein has worked to rebuild his chemical and biological weapons stock, his missile delivery capability, and his nuclear program. He has also given aid, comfort, and sanctuary to terrorists, including al-Qaeda members.
In 2005, when the Patriot Act was up for renewal, she approved it. Clinton voted against the confirmation of John Roberts and Samuel Alito to the Supreme Court. She voted against banning gay marriage, but she joined the same conservative purists introducing the Family Entertainment Protection Act, which would protect children from inappropriate content in video games. She helped to create a Democrat PAC and a Senate war room to handle political messaging. In 2007, she voted against surge into Iraq, and then she announced her run for president. She faced a competitive primary against fellow Senator Barack Obama. Her campaign used racism against Obama, and a lot of her attacks would be picked up by the Republican birther movement and the claims that he was a radical Muslim. Clinton would lose to Obama. As a consolation prize, Obama appointed Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State from 2009 to 2013. Hillary supported a troop surge of 40,000 in Afghanistan. Biden was against it. Obama, always the compromiser, decided to do a troop surge of 30,000 and a timetable for withdrawal. Clinton tried to rebuild ties with Russia. She provided over the Arab Spring. Clinton supported intervention in Libya. She also was involved with the plot to kill bin Laden. Hillary Clinton was often one of the most hawkish members of the Obama administration. During the Benghazi attacks, he took responsibility for the security lapses, and after Obama's re-election, Hillary Clinton went back to private life, focusing on the Clinton Foundation. She often appeared for speaking engagements with Wall Street firms, business conventions, or U.S. foreign policy conventions. She resigned from the Clinton Foundation in 2015 to run for president. She ran a campaign as the establishment choice, facing off against Bernie Sanders. After winning the nominations, she lost the Electoral College vote to Donald Trump.
I am not going to talk about big ideas like single payer.
After 2016, she maintained a low profile, popping up for speaking engagements and to endorse Democratic presidential candidates. She became involved with media ventures, producing Apple TV and CW shows, became Chancellor of Queen University in Belfast. Kamala Harris, the 2024 loser. Harris grew up the daughter of professors. Eventually, she went to Howard University and law school in California. She became a prosecutor, hired as a deputy district attorney in 1990. In 2002, she became San Francisco district attorney. Controversially, she cracked down on truancy by prosecuting parents of kids that were chronic or habitual truants In 2010, she became the first woman, African American and South Asian American, to be elected California Attorney General, being the Attorney General from 2011 to 2017. She created a homeowner bill of rights. She supported criminal justice reform, and in 2016 ran for the Senate, endorsed by Barack Obama and Joe Biden, becoming a senator from 2017 to 2021. Harris was an opponent of the Trump administration. As senator, she supported the DREAMS Act and the federal legalization of cannabis. She questioned Brett Kavanaugh during the confirmation hearings. She was a target of a mailman bomb attack. She attempted but failed to make lynching a federal hate crime. Harris was a progressive senator, co-sponsoring the Green New Deal. She attempted to run for president in 2020 but lost the Democratic nomination, being the first to drop out.
You also worked with them to oppose busing. And, you know, there was a little girl in California who was part of the second class to integrate her public schools. And she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me.
She became Biden's VP. They campaigned in 2020 and won. Harris is currently vice president and had been since 2021. Harris was an absent VP and Biden didn't want to be outshined by her. Harris being out of the public eye during Biden's presidency, she was unprepared for running for president. When Biden had to drop out after the mental decline became too obvious.
With everything we have to do with, look, if we finally beat Medicare.
The government, and Donald Trump certainly, should not be telling a woman what to do with her body. I have talked with women around our country.
Now that she lost, it is unknown what she might do. It has been said that she might run for governor of California, but we have to wait and see.